Hello, my fellow oil painters. My name is Gabby, and I'm a wet oil painter. And today I want to talk a little bit about paint tubes. Now, you might think you don't really need to know anything about paint tubes, but I'm here to say you might. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is empty tubes. So this is an empty tube. I use these for two things. Now they come like this. They have sort of a rubber thing on the bottom for sealing it up, and then they come sealed on the top. So I use them for two things. I use them if I make homemade paint, and that's something we'll talk about in a different lesson. And I also use them for retubing. So if you ever have a tube like this one here that is, and this one's so small I won't retube it, but like a bigger one that is torn, has really big holes in it, and you don't want the paint to dry out, you can take that paint and you can put it into this empty tube. You work the paint down like this, get as much air out as you can, then you squeeze the bottom so it's nice and flat like a normal tube of paint, and then you roll it up. You can get these usually at painting stores, usually about $1 or $2. And it's always good to have a few of these around. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about is lids. Just really quickly, this is a bag of lids, and I keep the lids off of my paint tubes as I run out of paint, because sometimes a little break, or it will get lost, or roll under somewhere and you can't find it for a little while. So having an extra supply of old paint lids is a good idea. I should have actually cleaned these out better. I didn't really clean many of these out, but I would suggest that you do that after you empty a tube. Then wipe it out really well, let it soak in some Fitter, and then continue to clean it out until it's nice and clean. And then it's ready for the next time you need a new lid. I got some paint today actually that came in, and this particular tube had holes in it. Now this is some paint that I got from somebody else, but it actually had gotten hit by the corner of another tube, and it ripped a hole. Actually, it ripped a few holes into this tube. So what do I do with this? Do I just throw it away? Not me, absolutely not. So what I would do with this is I will either retube it, or I will wrap it in some plastic wrap, or I'll put it in a Ziploc bag, and then it'll go on my easel to be used right away. So anytime I have a leaker like this, I try to put it into the front line of the paint that I'm going to use, and then I'll get it used up. So if I do have to retube a paint, then how do I do that? So I would cut open the tube and scrape as much out as I can. I would probably squeeze it if I could squeeze it out, but a lot of times you're retubing because you have to retube. And so if you try to squeeze it, paint will come shooting out in all kinds of directions. So that doesn't work really well. So the best thing to do is to just cut the tube apart. So I'll show you that really quick. I use a palette knife to do this. Now if you ever do this, do note that these palette knives are extremely sharp. I also do this cutting open of these tubes when I get to the very bottom of a tube and they're empty, and I want to get all the little bits of paint left out of it. I do this. So basically every tube of paint, when it's done with me, it's already filleted open. So I go right along the shoulders of the tube and I cut it off. Okay. And now I can get in there and I can dig all of that gunk out of there. Now usually I will have squeezed out, if I can, as much of this stuff beforehand so I don't have a big gob of it. And then I take my knife and I just really gently slide down the side of the tube. Until I get down to the bottom. And then I open them up, and I'll take either a brush or my palette knife, and sometimes both, and I will scrape/wipe as much of this stuff out as I can, and then I either put it on my palette, or if I'm retubing, it would go into a tube. If you, anytime that you have a tube of paint, just like a tube of anything, you always want to squeeze from the bottom and work it up. It's kind of obvious, but not all people do that. So always work your paint up. Don't squeeze in the middle, because not only does it displace paint that then you have to try to work up later on, but it also can weaken the tube and make it more conducive for tearing. So let's talk about getting lids off of tubes. So lids get stuck on tubes because paint gets stuck underneath them. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, first, obviously, you try to use your hands. Nothing comes out. So then you can take a plier, and it comes loose. Perfect, right? So what happens when you take a plier and it doesn't come loose? Okay, no matter how hard you try, it doesn't come loose. What you do is you take the plier and you squeeze, not the top of the cap, but the lower part of the cap. And you pinch it. A needle nose is good for this, a needle nose plier. You pinch, and then you sort of turn the tube, and you pinch, and you turn, you pinch, you turn, you pinch, you turn, turn, okay? And what that does is it breaks up the paint. And I discovered that sort of on accident, but it really, really does work. So, now it comes off. Now, had it not come off, what I would usually do then is if there's a bunch of paint that's like stuck down around the bottom, I'll take my palette knife, and I'll scrape all that paint away. And then I will take the tube and I'll set it in like a little jar of paint thinner, right? So it's just deep enough to cover up to the shoulder of the paint tube. I'll let it sit in there for a minute or two, really just a minute or two. And then I'll pull it back out and I'll do the squeezy squeeze thing with the pliers again. And then usually I can get the lids to come right off. And I've had some really stubborn lids, so that is pretty much the fail-safe. So they get stuck. And why did they get stuck? Because they get dirty. Now, this tube of paint I have neglected, and so it has gotten dirty around here. Whenever I take paint out, I try to then push the sides of the tube just a little bit to back the paint up into the tube. Not so that there's really much air, because you don't really want air in these, but just enough so that when I put the lid on, it doesn't come squishing out. And then if I do get it where I have a tube that's got this all squished out and the neck is all dirty, I'll take a paper towel, sometimes with thinner, and I will wipe that down until that's nice and clean. And sometimes it requires a palette knife too to scrape some of this stuff off of here. And then I'll go inside the lid and I'll scrape out any of the chunks that are in there. I'll wipe it out with a paper towel really well. And then it'll be nice and clean, and then it's ready to go back on there. If you let them get really gunky like that too, another thing that happens is you don't get the lids on the whole way, and then it can make your paint dry out, and it can make the tubes leak. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is how to deal with your paint to keep it going down into the tube properly. So you can do it two ways. You can physically roll it, and that's what I usually do with mine. As I'm emptying them, I just slowly roll them. The thing is, sometimes they crack on the sides, and so to avoid that, you can get these things. They're called keys or paint rollers or whatever you want to call them. I guess I call them keys. I don't really know what they're called. This is not a good example. That one's too fat to fit in there, so we'll try this one. So you shove the bottom of the paint tube into there, and then you just roll it up. That one's not good either. That one's cracking. Oh, we'll do this one. Okay, so you shove it in there, and then you just roll it up. I have a ton of these, but because I also have a ton of paint, I find they take up space in my drawer, so I usually don't use the keys, but that's another thing that you can do. So just a little lesson on how to deal with your paint tubes. I hope you have learned something important. Any questions or comments, put them in the comment section of the video and I will happily answer that. Thank you for watching. Until next time, I'm Gabby. Happy painting!